this coding time-lapse, I'll be building a news website from HTML, SCSS, and JavaScript while sharing my thought process from start to finish. You'll see me set up my project files, turn a Figma design into responsive styles, build the layout with CSS Grid and Subgrid, and build an animated hamburger menu that's accessible. This design is a Front-End Mentor challenge, and you can check out my source code at Front-End Mentor, which I've linked down below. This isn't sponsored, I just highly recommend them as a place where you can practice your front-end skills, and they have a great community that you can join for free. Alright, let's get into it. I decided to use Vite to build this project. It's a build tool that can compile your Sass files, and the setup is a lot faster and easier than using Gulp, so Vite is really winning me over. When you install it, it comes with some starter files, so I first had to go in and remove all the code that I didn't need. I'm really just using Vite to compile my Sass files and run the local server. And this is the Figma design from Front-End Mentor, which we'll be working from. Now to set up the Sass styles, starting with our global styles, which I'm storing in a Sass partial file, global.scss. First, we're getting all the colors from our design and saving them as CSS custom properties. Then for the fonts, I like using this fluid typography calculator because I can plug in the font sizes for both mobile and desktop for the different headlines and paragraphs, and it'll generate a responsive font size that doesn't need media queries by using the clamp function and some math. And I'm saving each of the clamp functions as CSS custom properties. For the font sizes that are the same on both mobile and desktop, I don't need the clamp function, but in order to more easily convert from pixels to rem units for accessible font sizing, I'm copying over a Sass function that I use on all my websites that will convert it for me. And I'm using it to replace the rem numbers generated from the fluid typography calculator site so that I can more easily just eyeball the number in the function to see what the min and max font sizes are. Now in my custom properties, I'm naming the font sizes from extra large, large, medium, small to extra small, and then the default body text. After getting our colors and font sizes saved as CSS custom properties, the next step is to export all the images from the design and put them in my project files. I've exported that W logo image as an SVG and the other images on the website as JPEGs since they're more photographic. I always optimize my images before putting them on the website, usually at tinypng.com. Alright, the next step is to write out our HTML markup. Before writing any code, I study the design to figure out what my approach is going to be. You can split up the main part of this design into 3 columns. The top left feature section takes up 2 columns, then the new section on the right is 1 column, and below them the blog section is taking up the full 3 columns. Now, in my markup, I try to use the proper semantic HTML tags. In the body tag, I'm going to put the top navigation in a header tag, and then the rest of the website goes in the main tag. In the top navigation, I'm adding the logo image, which will link to the home page, and then I'm adding alt text and width and height attributes so that the browser will know the aspect ratio of the image. The navigation links will go in a nav tag with an unordered list with each link in its own list item. Now in the main tag, I'm adding the HTML for the first part of the website, the feature. Each part of the website design will go in its own section tag in the markup with a BEM or block element modifier class name. We'll be using this class name in our Sass file names and in the class selectors. Next up is the news section, which links to 3 articles published on the website. Since these articles can be considered standalone pieces of content, I checked to see how Smashing Magazine handles this situation and saw that they put each linked article in an article tag, so I'm doing the same thing. In addition to reading the docs on Mozilla Developer Network, I try to look at big respected websites to check for best practice. Now we're adding the markup for the blog post section. You can see my class names are following that BEM approach with the blog as the block name, followed by a unique name for each element like number, headline, and description. And for each of the images, I'm adding some nice descriptive alt text. The last HTML markup I'm adding is how to handle the feature image. We have 2 differently cropped versions for mobile and desktop, so in order to show the correct version, I'm using the picture and source tags. In the source set attribute, I can load the mobile and desktop images and the 1x and 2x versions for each. The default image will be the mobile version in the image tag, And then the desktop image in the source tag will override the mobile image for viewport widths of 1024 pixels and greater. Now the image will switch from the square crop on mobile to the landscape crop for larger viewports. Alright, time to start adding some boilerplate styles. After this recording, I discovered that you don't actually need the font size 100% rule, so just FYI, but you do want that box sizing border box rule. We're loading our fonts from Google Fonts and then making sure we have all the font weights that we need. For the headline and paragraph tags, I like zeroing out the default margin on top, and we're adding a line height of 1.5 for body text and 1.1 for headlines. Now I'm adding styles to the wrapper class. This is a really cool technique that I learned from Kevin Powell, which uses the min function to limit the max width of the content to 1110 pixels wide for larger viewports. And for mobile viewports, it'll add a margin of 16 pixels on either side. Then we'll center the wrapper content using margin inline auto, which will only set the margins on the left and right sides. It's pretty cool that we can do all of this with just 2 lines of CSS. Now we're going to start adding styles for each section of the website, going from top to bottom. For the top navigation, I'm using the BEM block name header and adding class names to the header elements, then creating a Sass partial called header.scss for those styles. I'm sizing the logo image in the header styles and also adding some boilerplate styles for all images so that they will be display block and not get wider than 100% of the available width. The height of auto means that I can size the image just by using the width property without skewing the image. Alright, for the navigation links, I'm zeroing out the default margin and padding on the UL tag and removing bullets from the list items. Then I'm adding a class to the anchor links so I can set the color, font size, and line height styles for mobile. The links on desktop are bigger, so we need to change the font size by adding a media query, which I store in Sass mixins to make it quicker to write. I need to add width and height attributes for both mobile and desktop feature images, which I forgot to do earlier. Next up is adding styles for the feature section. I'm creating a new Sass partial feature.scss for these feature styles, and we're styling the feature headline with a CSS custom property for the font size. Unfortunately, the clamp function for font size isn't working. I didn't realize this at the time, but if you have a function in a CSS custom prop in Sass, you need to interpolate it in the custom property in order for it to load. This issue was also affecting the rem functions in the CSS custom properties. I did some research and troubleshooting, but finally just gave up and started copying and pasting the clamp and rem functions from the custom properties into the actual style rules. I did finally figure out what was going on between recording sessions, so later on offline I corrected my styles to interpolate the functions in my custom props and got my font sizes to work the way I originally wanted. This was honestly pretty frustrating, but it's all a part of being a web developer. And if I hadn't been able to find the solution, the workaround of not using custom props for font sizing would have worked just fine too. Alright, now we're adding the styles for the other parts of the feature section, the paragraph and the read more button. For buttons, I like sizing them by adding padding around the button text instead of setting a static height or width, because with padding, the button size will adjust if the button text gets longer or shorter. Next up is the news section. Just like with the feature section, I'm creating a new Sass partial for the new styles, then adding class selectors for all the HTML elements. We're adding the background color and padding for the dark blue block, then making the H2 tag yellow and the title of each article white. After the title text styles, I'm adding space under the titles using margin and styling the description paragraph. I also need to add the divider line between articles. I decided to add it using a bottom border for each article, and then targeting the last child pseudo class so the last article in the block won't have the border. And here's where I was walking through the interpolation of the clamp and rem functions in Sass, and now they're loading properly through the CSS custom properties. Here I realized that I hadn't added the favicon image yet, which is that little icon that shows up in your browser tab or on your mobile home screen for the website. Next up is the blog section. Again, we're creating a new Sass partial for the blog styles and adding nested selectors for each element. To lay out the blog posts, I'm using CSS Grid with one column at 100 pixels for the image and the second column set to auto for the text. I'm also creating 3 rows in the grid template for the number, title, and description, and using the grid row property to assign each grid child to the proper place in the template. I'm starting to style the text elements starting with the number, setting the color, font size, and font weight. Then I tweaked the gap property of the grid to have a different gap space between columns and between rows using the shorthand gap property. Then I had to tweak the alignment of the text elements in each blog post. I'm able to control the vertical alignment of each grid child with the align self property, which comes in pretty handy. Next is styling the H3 tag for each blog post title to not have that default link color, but to match the design. After styling the blog description paragraph and making a couple final little fixes in the news section, we are pretty much done with the basic styles. Next up is adding the mobile layout styles. I had to fix a mistake in the markup where I had left in some extra section tags that shouldn't be there. For a layout, I'm going to be using CSS Grid to lay out the main content. The grid parent is going to be the main article tag with the grid class, and then the feature, new, and blog sections will be the grid children. When you add display grid to an element, it'll automatically place the children vertically, each in their own row. This works for mobile since we want everything in one column, and I'm adding a gap of 64 pixels between the tracks of the grid. I'm also making the feature section a nested grid within the main grid to control its layout. However, when adding the grid, the button stretched out due to the default behavior of justify content. I fixed this by setting justify self-start on the button to align it to the left. Next up is the desktop layout. First, we need to add a grid template to put all the content into 3 columns and 3 rows. The feature section will take up 2 columns and 2 rows, the news section will take up 1 column and 2 rows, and the blog section will take up 3 columns and 1 row. In our grid, I'm adding a media query so that at widths greater than 1110 pixels, we'll use a grid template that is 3 columns sized equally at 1 FR and 3 rows with the first row 300 pixels tall to match the height of the feature image. Then I'm placing the feature section in the first 2 columns and the first 2 rows of the grid. I'm setting the grid template of the nested feature grid to subgrid, which means it'll use the main grid's grid template. Being able to have child grids use the parent grid template using subgrid is huge, and it saves a ton of headache in having to write extra styles. I decided to combine the feature paragraph and button into one div so that together they can take up 1 row next to the headline. For the news section on desktop, we're placing it to take up 1 column and 1 row. For the blog, we're using subgrid again and making it take up the 3 columns from the main grid. Now let's go back and polish up the styles. I'm tweaking the feature image so that it won't switch to desktop version until 700 pixels wide. And we need to add some space between the paragraph and the button. I was experimenting with Flexbox and using gap to add space, but it ended up being a lot simpler to just use margin block end to add the space under the paragraph. And I'm adding space above the blog section using padding block start. Next up is the top navigation. I'm going to build the desktop version first, but I realized that I needed to export the images for the hamburger menu and close buttons. For desktop, we need to put the logo on the left and the navigation links on the right all in 1 row. I'm going to use Flexbox for this and make the header tag the Flex parent. I'm using justify content space between to align the Flex children on the left and right edges. And to put all the links in 1 row, I'm making the unordered list another Flex parent and spacing out the links using the gap property. We also need to add some space above and below the top navigation, which I'm adding with padding block. Lastly, we need to add hover states. For the top navigation, we want the links to turn red when you hover over them. The Read More button needs to turn dark blue on hover, the new headlines should turn yellow, and the blog headlines should turn red. For hover states, I also like adding a transition so that the color changes animate more smoothly. I'm using the transition property to animate multiple CSS properties with the same transition duration. Next up is the mobile navigation. We're building an animated hamburger menu for mobile, which is a lot more complicated than the desktop navigation. First, we want to add the hamburger button that we can click to open the menu. We're using a button element for this, which is important for keyboard and screen reader users. And we're loading the hamburger image in the button as an inline SVG, and adding classes to the nav elements for our styles, and an ID on the button to target in our JavaScript. The aria expanded false attribute lets screen readers know that the button will toggle the menu content. And we're adding a navigation label that we'll use to label the hamburger button for screen readers. The hidden attribute will hide the label visually and from screen readers so that it won't be considered regular content that should be read out. Now we need to create a new Sass partial, nav.scss, for our navigation styles. For the button, I'm getting rid of the default background and border so that we only see the hamburger image. Next, I'm creating a new div called nav content to contain the menu content, the navigation links, and a close button. And the close button will contain the inline SVG for that X image. Now I'm going to start styling the nav content. Since we're using the same markup for desktop and mobile, these styles should only get applied on mobile. I copied a media query, but instead of targeting widths of 1110 pixels and greater, I'm targeting widths less than 1110 pixels. We're making the menu fixed and positioned 0 pixels from all sides, except for being 120 pixels from the left, and giving it a white background color. To position the close button all the way to the right, I set the margin inline start or margin left to auto, and removed some default padding from the button. Then I added margin block N to add space between the close button and the links, and padding inside the menu so things aren't, right up to the edge. We're already using Flexbox to space out the links on desktop, so I decided to do the same thing on mobile too. I just had to change the flex direction to be column on mobile and row on desktop. Now that the menu styles are good, we need to add that semi-transparent overlay that covers the main content while the menu's open. I'm using aria hidden true to hide it from screen readers, and adding styles for the background color. To put the nav content on top of the overlay, I moved the overlay before the nav content in the HTML so that in normal stacking the menu would come after and be on top of the overlay. To fade in the overlay, I'm setting opacity to 0 by default and adding a transition to make it fade in smoothly. The menu I want to animate in from the right, so I'm making it initially off-screen to the right with translate 100 VW and adding a transition. To lay out the logo and hamburger button for mobile, I'm adding padding block and using Flexbox. The overlay was blocking clicking on the buttons, so I'm setting it to be display none initially, and hiding the hamburger and close buttons on desktop, and also setting nav content to be display none. Alright, time to write our JavaScript to control the opening and closing of the menu. First, what I want to happen is when you click on the hamburger button, it will run a function called Open Mobile Menu. Then in the function, I'm going to change the aria expanded attribute from false to true. This signifies to screen readers that the hidden content has been expanded. I'm using the aria expanded true state as a hook in our styles to visually display the menu. The nav content, which is off-screen, will slide on-screen when we change translate to 0. However, if you remember, I had hidden both the nav content and the overlay initially with display none, so what I need to do is add some logic to detect if the window is mobile or desktop, and then if it's mobile, change the display none to display block. We can detect this with the window match media function, which will let us test if the window matches a given media query like viewport width. I'm having it match the same breakpoint that we're using in our styles and creating an event listener, which will trigger when the window crosses over that breakpoint width. When it triggers, I want it to run a new function, setupNav, which will initialize a nav to either be hidden or not hidden, depending on if it's mobile or desktop. Now for mobile, we want the nav content to be visible by adding an inline style to set display to block. But I forgot that I need to run the setupNav function once on page load with the current media match value, so that it'll unhide the nav content on mobile. If we're on desktop, I'm removing the inline style to go back to display none value from our styles. Because the sliding animation takes 500 milliseconds, I needed to delay adding the display block so that we don't see a flash of animation if we're switching from desktop to mobile. Next, we want to unhide the overlay when the menu's opened by changing the opacity to 0.5. But I realized that if I unhide the overlay on mobile, it blocked being able to click the open button. So to fix this, I added pointer events none so that you can click through the overlay. Next up, for the close button, I'm writing a new function, close mobile menu, that changes the hamburger button's aria expanded back to false to signify that it's closed. When the menu's open, it's usually a good idea to prevent scrolling. I did this by creating a utility class that sets overflow Y to hidden, and adding this class to the body tag, an open mobile menu, and removing it in close mobile menu. Alright, let's make this more accessible for keyboard only and screen reader users. Keyboard users may be using the tab key to navigate focusable elements like form elements and links, so I added some temporary code to return the focused element when the tab key is pressed and then released. The accessibility tree is a helpful part of DevTools to show you how a screen reader may be reading the elements on the page, and how you can better add labels to give helpful context. One thing we want to do is to make the nav content inert, inaccessible to screen readers and keyboard users when the menu is closed, similar to how it's visually hidden from sighted users. So I remove the inert attribute when the menu is open to make it accessible again. And just like how the overlay and locked scrolling visually hides the rest of the website when the menu is open, I made the main tag inert when the menu is open so that keyboards and screen readers can't get to it. Another feature for keyboard users that I added was that if you open the menu with a tab and enter keys, it will automatically focus on the close button, and closing the menu will automatically focus on the open button. Next up, I checked for accessibility issues and added the missing title tag, hid the close button SVG from screen readers, and labeled the close button with the aria label attribute. In order to make the nav content div accessible by screen readers, I give it a role of dialogue, since it basically behaves the same as a dialog or pop-up, and labeled it with our hidden navigation span. Lastly, to handle the sliding menu animation, I added a prefers reduced motion media query and changed the sliding animation to a fading animation for users who don't want to see that kind of motion. You can control this preference in your Windows or Mac settings. And I just wanted to mention that I learned all the accessibility stuff from Sarah Soidan's course, Practical Accessibility. It's not sponsored, but I found it super helpful if you're a dev, and I've linked it below if you're interested. Also, if you want to see this entire build in real time from beginning to end, I have the full 5-hour coding video up on my new second channel, Coder Builds, so check that out if you like long coding videos.